The first days of September 1914, Paris froze in anxious anticipation. From the northeast came the muffled rumble of artillery, German armies inexorably approaching the French capital. According to the Schlieffen Plan, developed at the beginning of the century, German troops were supposed to bypass the main fortifications with a lightning strike through Belgium and enter Paris within 40 days. And now this plan was close to realization. The French government was preparing for evacuation. Archives and valuables were hastily transported to Bordeaux. On the streets, one could meet refugees from the northern departments, telling of the German offensive. The military governor of Paris, Gallieni, issued orders to prepare the city for a siege, although many understood that holding the capital would be almost impossible. In these critical days, the commander-in-chief of the French army, General Joseph Joffre, sought a last chance for salvation. Studying intelligence reports, he noticed an error in the German formation, a gap between the armies that could be used for a counterattack. The Schlieffen Plan, one of the most ambitious military designs in history. Developed in 1905 by the chief of the German General Staff, Count Alfred von Schlieffen, it offered a solution to Germany's main strategic problem, a two-front war. The essence of the plan was simple and audacious at the same time: to deliver a lightning strike against France through neutral Belgium, bypassing strong French border fortifications, and within 40 days force Paris to surrender. Then, to transfer troops to the east against Russia, which, according to German strategists' calculations, would not have had time to complete mobilization by then. Count Schlieffen understood that the key factor for success would be speed. The right wing of the German army was to become a powerful battering ram, breaking through Belgium and northern France. He even left the famous instruction, "Strengthen the right wing." However, after Schlieffen's death in 1913, his successor, Helmuth von Moltke the Younger, made critical changes to the original plan. He weakened the right wing, strengthening the left and the center. This seemingly minor adjustment had catastrophic consequences. When Germany declared war on Russia on August 1, 1914, and on France on August 3, the modified Schlieffen Plan was put into action. On August 4, German troops invaded neutral Belgium, which automatically led to Great Britain's entry into the war, bound to Belgium by a treaty of guarantee. The first miscalculation of the German command manifested immediately: the heroic resistance of the Belgian army. The small Belgian army, numbering only about 100,000 men, managed to delay the German advance for 2 weeks. The fortresses of Liège, which, according to the plan, were supposed to fall in 24 hours, held out until August 16th. This precious time allowed the French to regroup forces and the British to land an expeditionary force. The second serious miscalculation was logistics. German armies advanced too quickly, communications stretched, and supplies lagged behind. Soldiers lacked food and ammunition. Many collapsed from exhaustion after days of marching. By the end of August, German troops had covered more than 300 kilometers, an incredible achievement for that time, but at the cost of extreme exhaustion. The third, and perhaps decisive, miscalculation was von Moltke's decision to send 2 army corps to the Eastern Front after the German defeat in East Prussia. This further weakened the right wing, the very battering ram that was supposed to ensure victory. By the end of August 1914, the position of the Allied forces on the Western Front had become catastrophic. After their defeat in the border battles, the French army was in retreat along the entire front. The French Fifth Army under General Larzac suffered a heavy defeat in the Ardennes. The Fourth Army was routed near Nevron. The Third and Second Armies barely managed to hold back the German onslaught in Lorraine. The British Expeditionary Force, commanded by Field Marshal French, having just arrived on the continent, immediately found itself under attack by superior enemy forces. In the Battle of Mons on August 23rd and the subsequent engagement at Le Cateau, the British displayed incredible resilience, but were forced to retreat, losing nearly 15,000 men, a quarter of their strength. The retreat was rapidly turning into a rout. Soldiers marched 40 kilometers a day under the scorching August sun. Many collapsed from exhaustion right on the roads. Discipline was crumbling. Instances of desertion and unauthorized withdrawal of entire units became frequent. At the headquarters of the French commander-in-chief, General Joffre, confusion reigned. His plan for an offensive in Alsace and Lorraine had completely failed. Now he had to improvise, trying to stop the German steamroller, which was inexorably rolling towards Paris. On August 30th, the French government decided to evacuate the capital. President Raymond Poincaré and Prime Minister René Viviani prepared to depart for Bordeaux. Ministries hastily packed documents. National treasures were removed from museums. The Louvre was empty. The Mona Lisa was packed in a special crate and sent to the south of the country. The military governor of Paris, General Gallieni, feverishly prepared the city for defense. By his order, barricades were erected, trenches were dug, and artillery batteries were installed on the approaches to the city. However, Gallieni himself understood that these measures were merely a desperate attempt to gain time. In private conversations, he admitted that without reinforcements, the city would not hold out for even a week. During these days, General Joffre's famous order was born: "Die, but do not retreat." However, in practice, the retreat continued. By September 1st, the advanced units of the German army were only 40 kilometers from Paris. Enemy reconnaissance planes regularly appeared in the sky over the French capital. German soldiers, despite their fatigue, were buoyed by the imminent victory. Their diaries and letters home contained phrases like, "Soon we will be in Paris. A few more days of marching and the war will be over." They believed that the Schlieffen Plan was working, and soon they would be marching down the Champs-Élysées. Fateful decisions in military history often seem insignificant at the moment they are made. Yet, they determine the outcome of entire campaigns. Helmut von Moltke, the Younger, nephew of the famous Field Marshal and the new chief of the German General Staff, made just such a mistake when he undertook to modify the Schlieffen Plan. Count Schlieffen's original concept envisioned the creation of a crushing right wing that was to pass through Belgium and northern France, enveloping Paris from the west. 7/8 of all forces were allocated to this direction. The left wing, operating in Alsace and Lorraine, was only to hold back the French advance, retreating if necessary. However, von Moltke, who took office in 1906, began to gradually erode this concept. He feared leaving the left wing weak, believing that the French might break through into the Rhineland. Therefore, he transferred part of the forces from the right flank to the left, violating Schlieffen's proportion. Instead of 7/8, only 3/4 of the forces remained in the decisive direction. The second critical change was the decision not to violate the neutrality of the Netherlands. From a military point of view, this was reasonable. Germany maintained a trade route through a neutral country, but strategically, it narrowed the offensive corridor and created additional logistical problems. When war became a reality in early August 1914, other miscalculations emerged. Von Moltke underestimated the speed of Russian mobilization. Already in mid-August, Russian armies invaded East Prussia. Although General Hindenburg and Colonel Ludendorff managed to defeat the Russians at Tannenberg, panic in Berlin forced von Moltke to make a fateful decision: to send 2 army corps from the Western Front to the Eastern. These two corps, about 40,000 experienced soldiers, were withdrawn from the right wing, the very one that Schlieffen had bequeathed to strengthen. In fact, von Moltke weakened the main striking force of the German army 3 times over. In late August, another problem emerged. The commander of the First Army, General Alexander von Kluck, acting on his own initiative, changed the direction of movement. Instead of bypassing Paris from the west, as the plan prescribed, he turned southeast, aiming to cut off the retreating French troops. This maneuver created a dangerous gap between the First and Second German armies. French aerial reconnaissance immediately noticed this breach. Airplanes of Captain Lepic and Lieutenant Vital discovered a 30-kilometer gap between the flanks of the German armies. This information reached General Joffre at a critical moment when he was looking for an opportunity for a counterattack. Upon receiving the intelligence reports, Joffre immediately realized the opportunity that had opened up. He hastily began preparing a new Sixth Army under the command of General Monnery, which was to strike at the flank of von Kluck's army. At the same time, he urged British Field Marshal French to cease the retreat and deploy troops for an offensive. Early September 1914. The atmosphere at French General Headquarters was one of last chances. General Joseph Joffre, Commander-in-Chief of the French forces, was hunched over maps where red lines marked the positions of German armies. His massive figure exuded calm, though the situation was critical. He had just received intelligence that could change the course of the war. Aerial reconnaissance had discovered a 30-kilometer gap between von Kluck's First Army and von Bülow's Second Army. This gap, like a crack in the German armor, was the result of von Kluck's overconfident maneuver, turning his troops southeast instead of the planned encirclement of Paris from the west. Joffre instantly realized this was France's only chance. He summoned his commanders and began to outline a plan that historians would later call brilliant in its simplicity and audacity. "Gentlemen," Joffre said, tapping a pencil on the map, "we will strike here." His finger pointed to the exposed flank of the German First Army. "General Monnery's Sixth Army will attack from the northwest of Paris. The British Expeditionary Force and our Fifth Army will strike at the center, directly into the gap between the German armies." The plan required perfect coordination between French and British forces, allies who until then had been retreating more than fighting together. It was especially difficult to convince Field Marshal French, whose troops were exhausted from heavy fighting and retreat. The British commander hesitated. His soldiers had marched over 200 kilometers in 2 weeks, fending off the pursuing Germans. Joffre personally went to meet French. This conversation became one of the most tense diplomatic moments of the early war. "Field Marshal," the French general said, "I understand your concern about the condition of your troops. But now, the fate of not only France but all of Europe is being decided. If we don't stop the Germans here, they will capture Paris, and then they will descend upon the British Isles." After long persuasion, French agreed. The British would fight. The next problem was creating a new Sixth Army. Joffre ordered all available reserves to be gathered, including territorial units and even cadets from military academies. Under the command of General Monnery, an army was formed that was to deliver a decisive blow to the German flank. But time was short. German troops continued their advance. Every hour of delay reduced the chances of success. The military governor of Paris, Gallieni, supporting Joffre's plan, proposed using all means of transport in the city to move troops. Thus was born the idea of the Marne taxis. Civilian vehicles would transport soldiers to the front. This decision, born of desperation, would become one of the symbols of the battle. On September 5th, everything was ready. Joffre gave the order for the counter-offensive to begin. His words were concise. "The moment has come when we must attack to save France." The riskiness of the plan was evident to all. If the Germans discovered the preparations, or if even one part of the complex operation failed, disaster was inevitable. But there was no choice. This was the last opportunity to prevent the fall of Paris. September 5th, 1914. Paris froze in anxious anticipation. The Germans were only 40 kilometers from the city, and it seemed nothing could stop their advance. But at this critical moment, a decision was born that would go down in history as a symbol of French resourcefulness and national unity. The military governor of Paris, General Gallieni, supporting Joffre's plan for a counteroffensive, faced a serious problem. How to quickly transfer troops to the necessary sector of the front? Railways were overloaded, horse-drawn transport was too slow, time was working against the French. And then Gallieni made an unprecedented decision. He told his officers, within a few hours, officers appeared on the streets of Paris requisitioning taxis. Drivers were ordered to report immediately to the Vincennes barracks. Many taxi drivers, hearing that it was about saving France, offered their services themselves. By the evening of September 5th, about 600 Parisian taxis, the famous red and black open top, lined up in a long column. Each car could take 5 soldiers with full equipment. Drivers were given military maps with marked routes and warned. As darkness fell, an operation began that would later be called the Quote Four. The cars departed in groups of 10 to 15 vehicles. They carried soldiers of the 104th and 103rd Infantry Regiments, reservists, hastily gathered to reinforce General Manoury's 6th Army. All night long, these improvised military convoys moved along the roads leading to the front. Some drivers made 2 or 3 trips, despite fatigue. The taxi meters were on. The French government would later pay each taxi driver his meter according to the standard fare. By dawn on September 6th, over 6,000 soldiers arrived at their positions. This was not many on the scale of a huge battle, but it was precisely these reinforcements that allowed the 6th Army to hold critical sectors of the front in the first hours of the counteroffensive. One of the officers who witnessed the arrival of the taxis recalled, "It was an incredible sight. Soldiers with rifles jumped out of ordinary Parisian taxis and immediately took up positions. Some didn't even have time to button their uniforms. They had been called to alert only a few hours before." The taxi drivers, many of whom were veterans of previous wars, showed wonders of bravery. They transported soldiers as close as possible to the front line, sometimes under artillery fire. Several cars were damaged by shell fragments, but fortunately, there were no fatalities among the taxi drivers. This improvised transport maneuver became a true symbol of national mobilization. For the first time in history, civilian transport was used for the mass transfer of troops at a crucial moment of battle. The French press, upon learning of it, immediately dubbed the operation the miracle of the taxis. But the main thing was the psychological effect. Soldiers who arrived by taxi entered the battle with special enthusiasm. They saw how all of Paris, all of France, had united for the fight. As one of the participants in those events wrote, "When I saw that we were being transported by ordinary taxis, I realized this is our last hope, and we have no right to lose." Dawn of September 5th, 1914. Over the plains of Île-de-France, a fog rises, concealing from view a massive troop deployment. The front stretched for 200 kilometers from Paris to Verdun. It was here, on these fields, that the fate of Europe was decided. At 6 o'clock in the morning, the artillery of General Manoury's French 6th Army opened fire on German positions. Shells exploded in the disposition of von Kluck's German 1st Army, which only a few hours earlier had confidently turned southeast, exposing its right flank. Monuri acted swiftly. His infantrymen, many of whom arrived at their positions in Parisian taxis, attacked from the north. The Germans, not expecting an attack from this direction, were forced to hastily regroup. Von Kluck, a talented commander with a reputation for invincibility, quickly assessed the danger. He made a decision that seemed tactically sound, but proved strategically fatal. He turned his army to repel the French attack. This maneuver further widened the gap between his troops and von Bülow's Central Army. On September 6th, the British Expeditionary Force entered the battle. Field Marshal French, despite initial hesitations, threw his soldiers directly into the breach between the German armies. The British, exhausted from a 2-week retreat, fought with incredible tenacity. One German officer wrote in his diary, "These Englishmen don't know when they're beaten." By the evening of September 6th, the gap between the German 1st and 2nd armies had reached 40 kilometers, a mortal wound in the German troop formation. French and British units immediately rushed into this breach. On September 7th, General Franchet d'Espéré's French 5th Army entered the fray. Its strike hit the flank of von Bülow's German 2nd Army. The Germans resisted desperately, but gradually lost the initiative. September 8th saw the critical moment of the battle. The German High Command realized that the Schlieffen Plan was on the verge of collapse. Von Moltke, at headquarters in Luxembourg, received conflicting reports. Without a clear picture of what was happening, he sent Lieutenant Colonel Hensch to the front to assess the situation. Hensch, arriving at von Bülow's position, was shocked by what he saw. Troops exhausted, ammunition running out, communication between armies broken. Exceeding his authority, he agreed to von Bülow's proposal for a retreat. On September 9th, the German command ordered a general withdrawal behind the Aisne River. The troops retreated in an organized manner, maintaining combat effectiveness. But the psychological effect was enormous. The invincible German war machine had faltered. On September 10th, the battle concluded. French and British troops, exhausted from 5 days of fighting, were unable to organize a pursuit. The front line stabilized approximately 50 kilometers north of Paris. Thus ended the Battle of the Marne, a battle that changed the course of the war. General Alexander von Kluck was an experienced commander, known for his decisiveness and tactical skill. On the morning of September 6, 1914, he stood on a hill, observing the unfolding battle. Through his field glasses, he saw General Monuri's French troops attacking the right flank of his army. The situation was becoming critical with each passing hour. Quote, the adjutant reported, "Von Kluck made his decision instantly." He turned to his chief of staff. This was a critical moment in the battle. The commander of the German First Army acted according to tactical necessity. The French flanking attack threatened his entire grouping. But the strategic consequences of this maneuver proved catastrophic. Von Kluck's redeployment of troops to repel the attack of the French Sixth Army led to an even greater gap between the German First and Second Armies. The breach, which was already a concern for the German command, now widened to 40 kilometers. Field Marshal John French, commander of the British Expeditionary Force, received intelligence reports of the German maneuver early on the morning of September 7th. Despite his soldiers' fatigue, he immediately ordered an advance. Quote, he addressed his generals, British troops, who had only recently been retreating under German pressure, now advanced with incredible determination. General Haig's 1st Infantry Division and General Monro's 2nd Division moved directly into the gap between the German armies. A German liaison officer, observing this advance, sent a panicked telegram to von Bülow's headquarters. "The British are breaking through between our armies. Urgent support is required." But there was no support. Von Bülow's Second Army was itself under pressure from General Franchet d'Esperé's French Fifth Army. The gap between the German forces was becoming a mortal wound for the entire Schlieffen Plan. Confusion reigned at the German High Command headquarters in Luxembourg. Chief of the General Staff von Moltke, receiving contradictory reports from the front, lost a clear understanding of the situation. He sent his representative, Lieutenant Colonel Hensch, to assess the situation on the ground. Meanwhile, von Kluck tried to salvage the situation. His troops fought desperately against the advancing French. In some places, the Germans even counterattacked, trying to push back the enemy. But with each passing hour, the situation became increasingly hopeless. On September 10, 1914, the German High Command acknowledged the inevitable. The initial plan for a lightning war had been thwarted. Chief of the General Staff, von Moltke, having received reports from the front, signed the order for an organized retreat behind the Aisne River. This document marked the end of the first phase of the war on the Western Front and the beginning of a new one, which no one had foreseen and for which no one was prepared. The retreat of the German troops proceeded in exemplary order. Despite exhaustion after weeks of continuous offensive and 5 days of fierce fighting, German soldiers maintained iron discipline. Rear guard units organized temporary defensive positions, holding back the advance of the French and British, allowing the main forces to withdraw to pre-prepared lines. Our troops are not retreating as defeated, but as forces tactically regrouping, one German officer recorded in his diary. And indeed, the withdrawal was methodical, preserving combat equipment and most of the supplies. The French and British commands, realizing the significance of the success achieved, sought to organize a pursuit. However, the Allied troops were no less exhausted than the enemy. Infantrymen, who had marched hundreds of kilometers first in retreat and then in counteroffensive, could barely stay on their feet. The cavalry, which could have pursued the retreating enemy, was scarce and also depleted. "Victory is ours, but there are no forces to fully exploit it," General Joffre bitterly stated in a telegram to the Minister of War. By September 12th, German troops had occupied defensive positions on the heights north of the Aisne River. Corps commanders received orders to fortify positions with all available means. What would later be called the race to the sea began. Both sides attempted to outflank the enemy's open flanks, gradually shifting the front line towards the English Channel coast. German engineering units worked day and night, creating a network of trenches, dugouts, and machine gun nests. What was initially planned as a temporary defensive line gradually transformed into a permanent system of fortifications. Soldiers, accustomed to maneuver warfare, with bewilderment mastered the art of digging trenches and constructing shelters. Over the following weeks, the front line stabilized. Allied attempts to break through the German defenses at the Aisne were unsuccessful. Each side tried to find a weak point in the enemy's formation, but met fierce resistance everywhere. By early October, a continuous line of trenches stretched from the Swiss border to the North Sea. Thus ended the maneuver phase of the war on the Western Front. A new era began, positional warfare, which would last 4 long years and claim millions of lives. Dreams of a swift victory were a thing of the past. Ahead was a protracted war of attrition, for which none of the belligerents were prepared, either morally or materially. News of the victory on the Marne instantly spread throughout France. Newspapers, which had only recently written about the imminent fall of Paris, now abounded with headlines about a great victory. Le Matin was the first to use the term "Miracle of the Marne," which was quickly picked up by other publications. The French press emphasized the almost mystical nature of the capital's salvation, comparing what had happened to legendary victories of the past, from Charles Martel at Poitiers to Joan of Arc at Orléans. President Poincaré, returning to Paris from Bordeaux, delivered an emotional address to the nation. "Frenchmen, our valiant army has stopped the enemy at the gates of Paris. This is not just a military victory, it is a triumph of the French spirit over German militarism. We have endured in the most difficult hour, and now we look confidently to the future." In the British press, the tone was more restrained, but no less significant. The Times published an editorial under the headline, "The Salvation of European Civilization," emphasizing that the Battle of the Marne prevented the establishment of German hegemony in Europe. The Daily Telegraph particularly noted the contribution of the British Expeditionary Force. "Our soldiers, shoulder to shoulder with French allies, turned the tide of history." In Germany, the reaction was complex and contradictory. Official reports presented the retreat as a tactical maneuver. Kaiser Wilhelm II maintained optimism in public speeches, declaring temporary difficulties and the inevitable final victory. However, in private conversations, the tone was entirely different. Chief of the General Staff, von Moltke, shaken by the failure of the Schlieffen Plan, fell into a deep depression. In a conversation with the Kaiser, he admitted, "Your Majesty, we have lost the war." He was soon replaced by General Erich von Falkenhayn. German military analysts, in closed reports, characterized the outcome of the battle as a serious strategic setback. Colonel Max Hoffmann, serving on the Eastern Front, wrote in his diary, "The Marne signifies the collapse of our entire military concept. Now we face a long war of attrition for which we are not prepared." Particularly painful for the German command was the realization that victory had been so close. General von Kluck later wrote in his memoirs, "We were within arm's reach of the greatest victory in history. One more march, and Paris would have been ours." In neutral countries, the Battle of the Marne prompted a reassessment of strategic calculations. Italy, wavering between the Triple Alliance and the Entente, saw in the outcome of the battle a sign that Germany was not as invincible as it seemed. The United States, while formally maintaining neutrality, began to lean towards supporting the Entente. The Battle of the Marne didn't just save Paris, it completely overturned the strategic picture of the entire war. The German command, until recently confident of a swift triumph, faced a harsh reality. The Blitzkrieg had failed. The Schlieffen Plan, developed over years, collapsed within 5 September days of 1914. Von Falkenhayn, who replaced the demoralized von Moltke as chief of the General Staff, made a radical decision: to switch to strategic defense in the West. This meant a fundamental revision of Germany's entire military doctrine. Instead of decisive offensive actions, the Germans began to create a deeply echeloned defense, transforming temporary positions into powerful fortifications. "If we cannot win in the West now," Falkenhayn declared at a meeting of the High Command, "we must hold the achieved lines and seek a solution in the East." In October and November of 1914, 6 divisions were transferred from the Western Front to the Eastern Front, where a large-scale confrontation with Russia was unfolding. This transfer became the first sign that Germany had shifted from a lightning war plan to a strategy of attrition, distributing resources between 2 fronts. For the Allies, the victory at the Marne had dual consequences. On the one hand, it breathed new life into the French and British armies, boosting the morale of troops and civilians. On the other, it gave rise to dangerous illusions about the possibility of a quick breakthrough of German defenses. General Joffre, emboldened by the success, was confident that the Germans were on the verge of collapse. In his address to army commanders, he wrote, "The enemy is retreating along the entire front. Our task is not to let him consolidate on new lines. This optimism led to a series of hasty and poorly prepared offensives in the autumn of 1914, which drowned in blood. Attempts to break through German defenses at the Aisne, in Artois, and Flanders resulted only in enormous losses and minimal territorial gains. By the end of the year, both sides realized a new reality. The front had stabilized along a line from Switzerland to the North Sea. Trench warfare began, a confrontation for which none of the belligerents were prepared. This new form of warfare demanded different approaches, different technologies, different psychological preparation. Instead of cavalry maneuvers and swift infantry attacks, monotonous sitting in muddy trenches, artillery duels, and suicidal attempts to cross the machine gun-swept space between trench lines. Military theorists and commanders frantically sought a solution to the positional stalemate. The British experimented with a new weapon, tanks. The Germans perfected artillery and developed chemical weapons. The French tried to find tactical methods to minimize losses during attacks. But all these searches took time, and the war continued. And with each passing month, the lists of dead, wounded, and missing grew. The trenches of Flanders and Champagne became graves for hundreds of thousands of soldiers from all warring parties. The Marne became a watershed, the end of the era of classical 19th century wars, and the beginning of a new era of total conflicts, where victory is won not by military skill, but by industrial might and the ability to withstand years of strain on all national resources. For ordinary soldiers who survived the mobile phase of the war, the transition to positional warfare was a psychological shock. One French infantryman wrote in his diary, "After the Marne, we thought we would be home soon. Now I understand that we are stuck here for a long time, maybe forever." The Battle of the Marne became not just a military event, it transformed into a powerful symbol of European unity in the face of aggression. When French and British soldiers fought shoulder to shoulder, they laid the foundation for Allied relations that would withstand 2 world wars and persist throughout the entire 20th century. For the French people, the Marne became more than just a victory. It transformed into a national myth of resilience and rebirth, comparable in significance to Joan of Arc's legendary victory at Orléans. As the philosopher Henri Bergson wrote, "In school textbooks, literature, painting, everywhere that was depicted as a moment of national unity. The taxis that transported soldiers to the front became a cultural symbol, immortalized in dozens of artworks. One of these taxis today occupies a place of honor in the Army Museum at Les Invalides in Paris, a silent testament to the days when the fate of a nation hung in the balance. For the British, the battle had a different symbolic meaning. It was the first major engagement of their expeditionary force on the continent, and its success reinforced the belief that Britain should and could play a decisive role in European affairs. As Prime Minister Herbert Asquith noted, "Even for the defeated Germans, the Marne acquired symbolic significance." In the interwar period, German military theorists endlessly analyzed the trying to understand where the fatal mistake had been made. The myth of the emerged, the notion that the army had not been defeated on the battlefield, but was a victim of political intrigues and insufficient support from the home front. In a broader European context, the Battle of the Marne was the first manifestation of what would later be called French, British, and Belgians united against a common threat, setting aside centuries-old contradictions. This experience of joint struggle, for all its tragedy, laid the groundwork for future European integration. Modern historians view the Marne as a turning point not only for the First World War, but for the entire 20th century. If the Germans had taken Paris in September of 14, France would likely have capitulated, and all subsequent history would have taken a different path. There would have been no 4-year-long trench warfare that exhausted Europe. The conditions for revolutions and social upheavals would not have arisen. Perhaps totalitarianism in its extreme forms would not have emerged either. Thus, 5 days of battle on the river Marne determined not only the outcome of the First World War, but also the entire face of the modern world. These heroic and tragic events became a symbol of how individual decisions and actions at critical moments in history can change the destinies of entire continents.